Apologetics, as we know it, might not work too much longer. Christian apologetics has its justification in 1 Peter 3 verse 15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. Be prepared to make a defense of your faith. How one defends the faith has changed from the early centuries of the church. In the last 100+ years, this has meant to argue in defense of your faith. That's because a few hundred years ago, our culture decided that reason is the thing by which all other things are to be understood. So Christian apologetics started defending the faith with appeals to reason. Christian apologetics became distinctly modern. Modern apologetics developed in the context of modernism, a worldview that came to full flowering in the latter half of the 19th century. If you need a refresher on the basic ideas of modernism, I've got a video about that. In this battle of ideas, Christians used the weapons of modernism. We used appeals to autonomous, objective, supposedly neutral reason. We aimed the weapons of modernism at modernism. We used the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument. We used historical evidence, presuppositional apologetics, the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, evidence for the historical Jesus, and evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. But you know how the ring in Lord of the Rings is super powerful? And that's the allure. But if you wield it, it changes you, and you turn into the thing that you oppose. That kind of happened in the Western Church. The Church itself was greatly influenced by modernism. We came to accept the primacy of reason as the arbiter of truth. Sort of. And we sometimes lost sight of the fact that human reason is fallen, like every other good thing that God has made. So now we find ourselves in the transition from modern society to a postmodern one, at least culturally. What was perhaps a legitimate strategy for modernism is not going to work at all for postmodernism. Postmodernism is in many ways the opposite of its predecessor. Christian apologetics will need to change. Postmodern culture isn't into reason, so rational arguments no longer have as much of an effect. But it is into feelings, but other things too, like images and symbols. I've got a few videos about postmodernism as well. So what apologetic approach will resonate with a postmodern audience? In this context, how do we give reason for our hope? Well, I think the first way is to show that we have it. And this means that our culture is going to need to see it. And what they see has to be absolutely authentic. So this means they need to see us in action. We need to meaningfully engage with people, not as objects of conversion, but as neighbors whom we love. We need to work toward the flourishing of our communities and the people in it. And I'm not talking about individuals here. This is very important. This is about communities. Christian communities that are conformed to Christ by His Spirit. The new apologetic is the Christian life being sanctified through living in community. Our sanctification will be seen in how we live day to day. It will show the fruit of our core commitments to the life into which Jesus calls us. And then, stories. Stories resonate big time in postmodern culture. Scripture is full of these. We need to use Scripture a little less to make arguments, and instead use it to tell the stories about why there is such good in the world, but also tremendous evil, and why we long for things to be better. And the stories about how God sent His Son into the world to make it possible for us to actually receive the one thing that would make things better. The stories of Jesus and what He did will resonate in our culture. So, stories. We tell the same story that we act out in gathered worship, that we live out in our everyday lives. The shape of our lives will be the new apologetic. Oh, and whenever I use the word worship, I never mean just singing. You shouldn't either. All of life is worship. This is what it means to be living sacrifices. Our work and our leisure and all our neighbor loving that we do in the community, and all that stuff is an integrated whole that is described by the word worship. Cultural postmodernism is a lot more interested in images and symbols than it is in words and propositions. And so some parts of our gathered worship need to be changed up a bit. We've got some of these things already. We just might want to emphasize them a little bit more, like baptism and communion. And then there's a lot of other things that we've jettisoned over the last 1,000 years that we might want to consider bringing back. So the time of the apologetics of rational argument is passing, and now it's time to have a look at the ancient apologetic. All 6 of my points above are derived from old church practices that fell out of practice because they didn't resonate with our modern culture, but they will resonate with the postmodern one. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.